So good morning, good afternoon, and potentially even good evening to everyone joining us from around the world. And welcome to Avolution's webinar, Aligning Enterprise Architecture with Business Process Management. Thank you to everyone for attending today. We've had a really good number of sign-ups for this topic. And because of the high number of people on this call, we have some house rules for today as well. So today's session will run for about an hour. For the duration, can you please keep your mics muted, just to keep a smoother flow for the presentations. We'll then have about a 15-minute session at the end for Q&A. So any and all questions throughout, please write them in the chat window. So a bit of a run of events for today. So I'll be running through a brief introduction on Avolution and Abacus. Then we'll get into our topic for today and the 4 key questions we like to cover. So starting with, where do I start and is this something I should be doing? What are the real benefits of modeling processes and other types of content? How do I manage the end-to-end models once I've started? What are some examples of the value I'll gain from combining EA and BPM? Then we'll move on to our case study for today, which is NXP. And then, like I said, we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. So without further ado, let's get started. So Avolution has now been running for 19 years after being founded in 2001 at the University of Technology in Sydney. We now have 7 offices worldwide with 3 global head offices located in Virginia for America, Sydney for Asia and Pacific, and finally for London for EMEA, where myself and Andrew are based. So because of this, we have now reached 100 different countries. I've worked with over 3,000 different companies with a mix of industries in between. And finally, we've been named as the Gartner leader of the Magic Quadrant and of the Forrester Wave for the EA tool market, something we're very proud of. So there's a bit of an introduction today for who will be presenting. My name's Scott Davidson. I'm one of the sales consultants at Avolution, coming to you today from sunny Twickenham, where unfortunately an umbrella is as essential as a mask this month. And we also have Andrew Luthwaite, one of our pre-sales consultants who will be presenting the key questions today. So to give you some context for what we'll be talking about today, I'm going to give you a quick overview of Abacus. So Abacus is made up of 2 fully integrated platforms, which are connected by a collaboration server and run off the same centralized repository. This creates a single version of truth throughout. The first of these 2 platforms is Abacus Studio. And as you can see on the screen, it's the roots of the product. This is the heavy lifting part of the tool where you'll be configuring your meta model, creating your viewpoints, and setting your users and permissions. Then we branch out into Abacus Enterprise, which is the pretty leaves of the product, if you will, where you can see your rich dynamic visualizations and interactive dashboards based on the decision analysis performed in Studio. So when you hear these terms mentioned today, hopefully this will give you an understanding of what we're referring to. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to Andrew, who's going to talk you through the 4 key points of today's webinar. So hand it over to yourself, Andrew.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so morning, everyone. Just before diving into the key topics, if you like, as much as cakes on screen probably don't represent business processes in its entirety, it is actually worth just making a quick connection to why this is on the screen. So since kind of March, May last year, one of the kind of largest search terms on Google was recipes for banana cakes, which is probably no surprise. And some of you on the call have probably actually been baking yourselves. And it's certainly something that we've been doing, or I've been doing here as well. Recently as well, I was thinking of actually baking a new cake. And there's aspects of that which are actually really important to talk through. And one of the things that kind of run through my mind initially was, well, I could actually tweak the recipe that I already have. Now, I've baked cakes before, I know what I'm doing, but I do kind of want to bake something that's slightly better. So I could make some small tweaks, bake it less, add more sugar. Or if I knew my cakes were terrible at the beginning, I could actually seek out an entirely new recipe. I could actually start completely from scratch. There are other aspects to that as well to consider. Actually, I've been baking larger cakes, maybe smaller cakes would actually produce better results. I've probably been doing things too manually with a wooden spoon. I probably should invest in the stand mixer perhaps. And all of that is actually probably slowing me down. Now, since March though, I've actually also had to consider my audience, my customers, if you like. At the beginning of March, at least during May time as well, it was me and my wife. And I could probably rely on her giving me some good feedback, if you like. But now I have a 3-month-old daughter, I probably need to consider some of the other aspects of that as well. The other key aspect of this is looking to the future. You know, if I was going to keep baking cakes, if I was actually going to keep baking these for the next 9 months, my daughter's going to get to an age where she potentially now becomes my customer. Now, I've got the systems in place to actually support that entire process of baking cakes. I have controls in place. I may need new controls. If we take the example of a 6-month-old daughter, then she might be eating cakes, and the controls in place there would be things like, you know, is she gluten intolerant? We need to remove dairy from those cakes. We now have a new feedback loop coming into my process. Now, all of these things make up processes, how we manage those processes, and day to day, we actually all run into those, whether it's getting our computers and software to work, which hopefully today it will, you know, taking our cars in for repair, taking flights when we used to be able to, going to the doctors. All of those aspects of our life contain processes. There's an interesting aspect of that as well. Quite a common thing that you'll hear people say is that bad processes tend to turn good people into bad people. And today, really what we want to focus on is business process modeling in its entirety, and also considering how that relates to enterprise architecture. Now, I've given you a quick analogy there, but what I really don't want to do today is focus on what BPM isn't. So we won't be talking in detail about different notations that you should or shouldn't be using. And there's a whole bunch of notations out there that can be actually useful, widely used. Some are more descriptive than others, and there's certainly pros and cons to each type of notation. It's an integral part, of course, of process modeling, but it's certainly not the focus of today. Another important aspect is actually around the terminology. And we say BPM as in business process management or modeling. Of course, there's other aspects to that. Whether we're automating processes, whether we're optimizing those, are we looking at products or tools? Are we looking at monitoring those processes? Eventually, all of these become part of the overall BPM structure that you actually deploy on your side within your organizations, and aspects of these are going to be covered today as well. One of the other things to consider is why process management, and we'll certainly get on to the benefits in a bit more detail later on. One of the first things to really consider, though, is when you look at process modeling or process management, your organization isn't going to run more efficiently just by documenting that process. It has to be followed, it has to be maintained and measured and improved. There has to be an idea of why we're actually doing that. It's a pretty big topic across most of our customer sites as well. We do quite a lot of work with financial customers, retail, manufacturing, and there's been a significant uptake in BPM across those areas, especially within finance as well, and process modeling for things like applying for loans, opening new accounts, getting payments from suppliers and third parties. All of that has actually taken a bit of a hit and a bit of a shift in the last few months as well. There have also been 3 separate studies here in terms of surveys of why people do process management. You'll see the biggest there is the reduction in costs and to improve productivity. So in most WebExes or webinars, you probably would have heard myself or other members of Avolution speaking. Costs are, of course, one of the fundamental aspects of anything that we do. But we also need to appreciate that that is maybe the primary goal, but that is also affected by the secondary ones. Improving customer satisfaction. Now, that's why these organizations, that's why these processes exist. And of course, the knock-on effect of improving your efficiency and making your organizations more agile by developing these processes tends to then reduce costs. Now, as an organization, we also need to start thinking about, well, where do we start? And what do we actually need to do when we think about business process modeling and think about EA? The first thing, I guess maybe coming from an EA background in that sense, is there's a structure, there's some kind of framework. You know, there's the idea that we're actually capturing and modeling each of the processes and each of the elements that we have. Maintaining and analyzing that, of course, is really important. Communicating this throughout the organization, and then reviewing and optimizing that as well. This is exactly the process I followed for baking cakes. We captured exactly what we were doing. We tried to maintain a consistency across that. We communicated that with the customers that I was dealing with. And then we reviewed those recipes, those processes, and tried to figure out how we could actually optimize that end-to-end workflow. That in a nutshell, of course, then translates into BPM. And that gives you some kind of foundation to build on going forward. Specifically, there are two areas to consider. So the first is the vision. What's the vision for business process management? We talked about some of those reasons for why doing BPM is a good thing in terms of reducing costs. And you do have to start thinking about the reasons for doing this. And we'll come on to some more of the worst parts about BPM and why people shouldn't be doing it in certain ways. But certainly understanding why you're doing something, what's the vision, what we actually want to achieve at the end of this, that is paramount. Second is organization. Typically, when we're dealing with customers, especially around process modeling, we want to understand what data exists, what information exists. You know, are there drawings? Are there Excel spreadsheets? Is it stored somewhere you can access that information? Is all of that information organized in a way that's actually useful? Now, of course, if it's not, that's another great candidate for starting on a more detailed and more structured way of managing processes to make sure that you have the organized information, at least translating that data into information, and then you have that vision of why you're doing that as well. One of the most common ways you'll actually see people start is, of course, drawing. You know, business process modeling is a visual language. It's one of the most common steps. Typically, boxes and lines diagrams are usually things you'll see. Again, using various notations. And it is a good starting point. You know, it's a good starting point to build up a view of your, what we might call your current state, understand what processes exist and what they actually do within the organization. But we do need to consider starting with primary processes. So some of the key aspects, and you'll see from those process modelings we just built, in terms of actually building these out visually, there are key primary processes that we should focus on. Those aspects are important because we want to focus on the things that are actually going to make the biggest changes within the organization. You know, do we need new services? Do we need to adapt the way we're offering loans? Do we need to make our production more efficient? Those are some of the primary ones. We can then start shifting to secondary ones. You know, do we have a backlog of social media posts we need to push out? Those kind of things can become secondary. And if there's a really important aspect of all of that, it's the idea that you should be actively managing a handful of processes rather than actually passively managing thousands. And one of the last things you want to do is just, you know, build a view of thousands and thousands of process models that you've built and designed, and yet you're probably not so confident that people are following those. They become really difficult to actively manage in terms of making changes to them, monitoring them, optimizing them, becomes very difficult. There is also the caveat and the difference, I guess, that we're highlighting between complex and complicated. Now, complex processes, of course, exist. They're large, they should be broken down into smaller processes, perhaps, or smaller models, but complexity isn't necessarily a bad thing. What tends to be the downfall is the complicated processes. Now, when we are building large process models, if they are complicated, again, when we look at what those are used for, they're used to be followed, maintained, monitored, optimized. If they become too complicated, then it becomes really difficult to follow, even more so to improve. So keep in mind that, let's say, the traditional view of printing off processes, sticking them on what maybe is your virtual wall these days or your home office walls, might have had some use, But certainly, I would say it's not the way forward. So if we actually look at some of the key benefits here in terms of managing processes, in terms of the ability of combining this with other content within our organization, we've looked at those headline benefits in terms of why people do process modeling. But there are probably 3 or 4 key aspects of this to cover. So the first is this increase in efficiency and agility. I think at times, and certainly some of the customers I've dealt with, and certainly within industries, there's the notion that process modeling would slow us down. It makes us less agile, let's say. But it's technically the opposite. If you've got processes in place where you know what's happening, you can make changes quicker to those. Your teams are more flexible because they realize what's happening and how things are changing. That does make you more agile. Processes, when people think make them less flexible, is usually because they're trying to maintain hundreds and hundreds of processes. Split that down. What can we actively manage? What are the primary and secondary ones we should be focusing on? And that will then in turn increase this agility. We also know by documenting these processes, what they do, why they work, why they don't, how we correct them. And that just allows us to scale. So we can scale, we can become more efficient in the way we manage our processes. And there's a great quote from one of the webinars we've been on recently for BP Trends, which is, wouldn't it be great if your process management capability was the thing that was managed the best? And that's key. If we can manage our processes to the best of our ability, that tends to make other areas of the organization easier to manage too. The next one is compliance and transparency. This comes back to some extent to the way we've talked about specific areas of enterprise architecture and business process modeling previously. And it's about the idea of making this information available. Now, if your processes are available for those users, if your processes are mapped correctly, then it does give us the ability to kind of reduce these aspects of things like micromanagement and hand-holding. If these processes are very clear, especially when it comes to transparency, everyone in the organization knows what's happening. Compliance in terms of regulations is obviously key as well. This has been a big thing, I think, certainly in the last few years for us. Some of the customers we work with, the compliance and regulations are changing every day. Yes, we have some kind of insight in terms of what's coming up, but the idea that we have these processes mapped means that we can integrate compliance as part of that process lifecycle. It shouldn't be separate. It should be part of the way you design processes. If regulations come in terms of the way we manage data, hold information, actually perform operations on that data, if we have processes in place that show those key touch points, it just makes it so much easier to change. Also, that kind of documented workflow tends to mean a high level of security. You're building yourself a framework here of trying to identify any potential issues that come up. Whether, again, it's about customers' data, whether it's around suppliers' information, whether it's about how our systems are built and how those processes support those, compliance and transparency become one of the key aspects of BPM and of EA combined. More specifically around EA is this continuous improvement. Now, there's an aspect around BPM, and I don't want to go into this in too much detail in terms of how it's supporting movements like digital transformation projects that people are working on. And the reason not to dwell too much on that, we do have a WebEx coming up recently, or very soon, sorry, to discuss that topic. But it's treated as an enabler. BPM should be something that's actively managed. It allows us to make those small changes. And when we do start combining this with other data sets, that's where this becomes the enabler. Which parts of the organization support this process? Which applications are supporting this process? What data does it have access to? What objectives and goals is this aligned to? Do we have the right infrastructure and capabilities in place for these processes? That's where we start combining BPM and EA to actively manage those end-to-end models. So this effectively is the combination now of other areas of that stack. We have these supporting processes. There are certain aspects of improvement, and those might be knock-on effects. We have applications listed here, for example, with various levels of availability. I certainly know that if my oven was available 50% of the time, I probably would be looking at new systems to support my cake baking process. So there are various aspects to consider outside of the pure BPM function that then complement each of these other areas as well. So once we've actually built those models, we've realized there are potential benefits to this. We've realized how we can actually start trying to achieve our vision, and we've organized that data. How do we actually maintain and improve? This, I think, is probably one of the most important steps. It's very easy at the beginning, I think, to just model processes. They're documented, you've ticked the box, it's fine, it's all good. But the maintenance of that becomes increasingly difficult. The speed at which technology changes, the speed at which new regulations come into play, if we were actively managing thousands of processes, it becomes close to impossible to do a good job of keeping that current state current. Now, one of the benefits, I think, of this is this co-ownership of information. If you are just drawing process models, so let's say in Visio, you want to make sure that people have access to that information. People should be collaborating on this data. You should be building models that are accessible. You should be building models that people can contribute information to, and that tends to lead to other benefits. So there's a whole bunch of webinars that we've done previously with customers, and one of the biggest things that come out of sharing the information internally, of course, within their organizations, is identifying things that they didn't know existed. If we're designing a process and we say it supports a specific system, it's trying to achieve these specific goals, there's likely someone in the organization that might know more about those systems, might know more about those projects that are affected, and can give us as process modeling analysts, let's say, a helping hand in guiding on how those processes are being designed. So make sure the information's available, make sure it's accessible, and make sure that you keep this current state repository. Once you have that maintained, then we can actually start looking at trying to analyze and optimize those models. So again, the key thing here is the fact that all of this information is connected throughout the model. Processes don't exist in isolation. Likewise, our application landscapes, our capability maps, our strategy roadmaps, they don't exist in isolation. A change in a process affects a system. A change in a process affects our capabilities or the goals we're trying to achieve. There's an entire model that's connected here, and that's something to appreciate. These things aren't simple, of course. There are levels of complexity, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are huge benefits from connecting each of these models together. One of the things you want to start doing, though, is once you've maintained and modeled these processes and certainly other aspects of the organization, there's data behind those processes. What do we actually want to try and achieve by changing a process? At the beginning, we might have thought, well, reduce costs, make ourselves more efficient, make ourselves more agile. Those are fine as headline terms, but the key thing is, well, how do we measure that? So the metrics-based side of processes and enterprise architecture is another fundamental aspect. If we think of our process and we think back to that baking process, I could be so much more efficient, maybe 3 times as efficient by having a stand mixer, perhaps. Perhaps if I baked smaller cakes, I could actually produce more product. There are various aspects to metrics which fall into, and we've kind of discussed this in detail previously, but fall into the way we subjectively apply the metrics and objectively apply them. We might want to be more efficient and more agile, but the objective approach is to actually build these calculations and build those algorithms that we're using. So we can rate things like maybe the costs or the criticality of a process based on the number of systems it's supporting. Maybe specific key primary processes that support critical parts of our organization are based off technology 10 years old, 20 years old, which aren't actually that reliable. Maybe we should be pushing some of those scores from the infrastructure and from the technology up to the process model. And keep that going, and you'll soon find that the goals and objectives you're trying to achieve might not be achievable after all. So these calculations are key. So we've managed the processes, we've modeled them. We now need to actually use parts of those data for quantifying the information. Security and risk is actually a key thing in here as well, which you see we've labeled, especially for processes that now require tighter controls on new regulations. You want to manage that balance of risk and security. There's also a key aspect here, and certainly around compliance, is just because you have that process mapped doesn't necessarily make you secure, doesn't make you less risk averse. It's documented, fine, but is it being followed? Are we actually monitoring what happens during that process? Are we seeing how long that process takes to complete? Are there bottlenecks within that process? All of this, all of the connected data in the models combine, and then we can actually use those metrics and calculations to move on to the next step. So again, we might want to think about those primary metrics that we have. The other key thing is what we might classify as the consequential metrics. So these are measures which shouldn't really change, but they're a bit more difficult to collect. For example, if we come back to this idea that I maybe have now started a business and I'm running my cake factory from my home and I'm sending all of these cakes out, and I want to increase my delivery speed. Now, that increase in delivery speed shouldn't have a consequential metric of goods being damaged during that shipping process. So the number of damaged goods ends up being that consequential metric. Now, again, it's a balance. You don't want to push one metric higher in detriment of another. So there's a fine balance there to be had, of course, but it's something to keep in mind. As much as you're focusing on the thing you want to achieve, keep in mind that those consequential metrics might come back. Now, where does EA come into this? Well, I mean, so far, EA has come into pretty much all aspects of what we've talked about. We've talked about the business aspects around process modeling and how we might manage costs. We've talked about how processes are connected to the data that we have in the organization, how it's managed, how it's accessed, is it secure? We've talked about these application layers. What systems do we have that support those processes? And because that technology landscape is consistently and continuously changing, we need to, of course, adapt those levels above. New applications, new regulations for data ultimately mean new processes to manage all of that. So I'd rarely say that we should still be treating EA and BPM as separate, unrelated topics. They are hand in hand. One thing that changes in the process, one thing that changes within another model or an application landscape can affect any part of that organization. Now, there is a generic example that we're going to quickly run through here. And I guess it's because it's something I came across recently over the Christmas period where we were given checks as Christmas gifts. And one of the issues, of course, over Christmas would be the traditional way of maybe paying in checks into an account would be I'd go to the bank, I might speak to various departments, there might be some manual sign-off process, but that allows me to actually pay that check in. Now, that process, of course, in the last few years has generally shifted. The pandemic, of course, has just made that impossible, though. Now, paying in the check is still the goal, but every other aspect of that has become impossible or difficult. And so when we're designing new services, this is a key aspect of them combining BPM and EA. Now, the goal of paying in that check is still key. Not all, but some banks now have a mobile app that we can use. We take pictures of those checks. We might digitally sign some of those. There'll be a new process within those organizations that helps deal with that. And there might even be some levels of automation. And maybe help during paying that in. Maybe guidance on what the best picture looks like. Maybe help on where to go next once I've paid that check-in, so offering new products, new services. But this is a new process that has to be designed around this area. The reason for highlighting this, though, is not necessarily that new process, but the effects of designing something new, designing that new service. There are going to be inherent risks involved with the idea that we're now using a mobile app, for example, maybe unsecure Wi-Fi signals. We also need to consider what we're doing with that new layer of information. Previously, I could walk into a bank account, it's a physical check, it's maybe handed to the sorting office, it gets processed in the next common 246 process. Now, however, we need to store that information somewhere. What databases are we putting that in? What applications do we have to analyze those images and those screenshots that people are taking? Those processes, however, are still human-based. There is still going to be an aspect of people involved within processes. And I think that's fundamental, whether it's things for ensuring fraud detection, which of course there are cutting edge technologies to do that, but people are still involved within that process. People are still involved in that process to provide support and provide assistance as well. And maybe from an automation perspective, there are multiple layers to this. If we are applying these new products and services, and we're bundling this up into these architectures that we have, we need to keep in mind what those architectures are giving us. And one of the things that is actionable architecture. So actionable architectures that have combined elements from enterprise architecture, applications, technologies, combined with BPM, gives us the ability to do the right things at the right time for the right reasons. And there are 4 key aspects of that. The first is context. We need clearly defined purpose of what we're doing. What's the motivation? What's the scope? As we've already mentioned, we also need to be collaborative. What's the availability of these architectures and the information we're building? Is it accessible to all the stakeholders involved? The third is the connectedness of this model. Can we trace the links across this information? You know, we might be using capabilities from other processes that have been designed, but there's an appropriate level of change management and configuration management as part of that connected model. And finally, is it consumable? Yes, we might have stakeholders having access to this, but is it understood? You know, different stakeholders have different perspectives, different viewpoints. They require those to have a good understanding and a good buy-in. So when it comes to these actionable architectures, the new services we develop, the new processes that we model, the new integrations that we have across the entire architecture, these actionable architectures become a key foundation of how we actually build these models. Now, from that fictional example, and I'm probably sick of hearing my voice, we're going to pass back over to Scott to talk through a very specific example.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was brilliant. Yeah, just as Andrew said, it's great to see where this can be done, and I suppose the theory behind it. Today, I think it's very important to look at potentially where it has been done, and we're looking to the case study today, which is NXP. Now, looking into this, I'm going to split this into 3 sections between their objectives, the solution applied, and then finally, what can we learn from this? So before we do this, I'm just going to give you some background on NXP. So NXP are a semiconductors manufacturer based over in the Netherlands. A lot of the work they do is to produce integrated circuits, commonly referred to as ICs. So everyone here will have hundreds of ICs in our daily lives without knowing it probably, between phones, cars or microwaves, they really are everywhere. NXP are the #1 supplier for the automotive industry for items such as distance between cars, airbag sensors or remote access car keys. They're also the leader in the near communication field. So if you're making contactless payments, which more and more of us are, it's highly likely you're using an NXP IC. They are a spin-off from Philips Electronics originally, and they've acquired Freescale, which were a spin-off from Motorola. So it now makes them the 4th largest in the world for marketed electronics, not including memory. And because of this, they now have 30,000 employees worldwide. And finally, a feather in NXP's cap as well is that they were named the favourite employer in the Netherlands last year. So clearly a great place to work. Now, looking on to their objectives. So we're looking at the reasons for NXP getting into architecture and what they wanted to achieve through modeling. So these are split into two, primary and secondary objectives. So if we start with the primary, we're looking at, firstly, risk management. So in some cases, major incidents occur, and these were mostly caused by changes that had an unforeseen impact. Secondly, we're looking at mergers and acquisitions. So NXP have had 4 or 5 smaller acquisitions about 4 years ago, and it's important to be able to integrate with those companies as quickly as possible. And finally, it's to improve insights into processes and IT components. So these also had secondary objectives to support these, such as improving quality of modeling work done by their business process or IT architects, enabling to capture modeling in a single repository, and having one common language throughout. So how did they approach this solution? It really focuses around 3 points that we're going to talk about today. So it's about setting a base, applying levels, and combining data in dashboards. Now, what do I mean by this? Starting with set a base, NXP wanted to start their modeling base with a language to suit their stakeholders. So they created their own meta model, utilizing BPM for their processes and combining this with Archimate for business, application, and technology architecture. In addition to this, to reduce the internal discussions or disputes when they began to map their current situation, they started to combine a business activity and a business function. So they mapped both to become business functions to set a more simple base. Now, progressing on to how they applied levels. So if we look at this diagram on screen, you can see their business function model and process models with levels applied to each. So applying several levels lets users view the processes on the level at which they understand. For instance, a stakeholder may only need to know the information going into a business function and going out of it. However, if an architect needs to delve into level 5, for instance, they can do, but only when necessary. What this means is that you're accessing your model at a level tailored to your understanding based on how far you drill down. And finally, combining data in dashboards. So these are some of the results you can access by combining processes with more elements of your enterprise architecture, such as applications, technology, or organizational structure. You can look at the wider picture of views, for instance, cost per business function, with simple and easy to digest visualizations like we can see here on the screen. This then becomes easy to compare functions like the cost of financial planning or the cost of financial operations for the year, just as an example. Now, the third and final point I said we would look at is what can we learn from this? Now, I always like to try and relate this to a current situation in the world. And in today's climate, more people are working from home, but also realizing it might be a while before gyms are opening again, especially for the UK at least. More people are starting to work out from home as well. So if you started a new program, working with a PT or researching plans yourself, you may well have come across this equation. Now, this is simply stating the lower the weight, the greater the form. And unless you're trying to be the world's strongest man in 2021 or the years to come, this is a good principle to follow. So you'll be able to make continuous progress without injuries or other potential setbacks. And as well, this may also teach you how to perform exercises correctly as well. Now, how can we relate this to what we can learn from NXP's case study? So if we were to keep the equation the same, but substitute the wording to be more appropriate, so in this case, changing weight for objectives and changing form for focus, we can relate this to what Andrew was saying earlier and something NXP stuck to. If you can reduce the number of objectives you're chasing at one time, you're able to include more valuable elements of enterprise architecture. This will help you to improve your project focus, just as NXP have done. Now that wraps it up for today's case study, and we have about 15-20 minutes at the end for questions, so please do send them in. I think we already have a couple fired across. Let me just have a look. So first one for you, Andrew. I'll just get straight into them.
Sure.
So I've got on here saying processes can contain sensitive information. What's the best way of collaborating and sharing whilst also controlling access to their data?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, we've talked about processes so far, maybe not delving into some of the nuances of what's contained in those processes. But there are certain aspects we've touched on, such as, what data did they have access to? What systems do they use? We might have also considered certain, let's say, sensitive metrics, whether it's the performance of that process, which might have some correlation to the department that performs it, whether it's the cost of the process, which is maybe rolled up from the applications that support it. There are going to be aspects of those processes that contain that sensitive information. I think the key bit here, though, is if you have designed process models, you're going to have different perspectives of it. You might have some audiences that just have, let's say, a high level view, just what the process is. Some users might only have a view of the detailed tasks and activities within that process or the steps. There are going to be levels of control and access that you also want to apply to those metrics. Now, what permissions do we want to apply? Do we maybe want to make it read-only to some users? Maybe we want to allow people to edit those views and those models, but not let them see properties like cost and performance and reliability. So typically, I'm speaking from our kind of tool perspective here, though, but typically those levels of access rights and permissions are something you should be considering across all of your model. You might give people horizontal views across certain areas of the model. You might give them vertical views across the entire stack, but it's up to you how you segment that. The key and important thing there, though, is yes, apply permissions in those areas where there is sensitive information, and of course, consider how people are interacting with that data as well.
Thank you very much. So next one coming in, we've got is it possible to link diagrams to components in a catalog, e.g. have a process inventory, including process names, owners, criticality, and then be able to link diagrams to the entries in the catalog?
Yeah, so I think this is maybe a bit more of a specific tool question to some extent, but there are aspects of this which are key as well. I think when you're drawing process diagrams, there's the idea that that visualization itself is the process, and that's fine. You might also want to capture the process as a top level object or component. So what that allows you to do is have this inventory, this catalog view of all the processes that we have. And then potentially from those high level views, you might apply links to those catalogs, to those inventories. The other thing as well is once you have this visualization, let's say a one-page view of all the primary processes that we're focused on, those links might be to other content within the tool, or it might be links to external content. Typically, if you're designing processes, you might have detailed documentation, perhaps on SharePoint or in Teams or something that you might want to link to. So it's important to keep in mind that those models that you're building, again, aren't in isolation. There are various views, various visualizations, various viewpoints of the same data for different audiences and different stakeholders.
Thank you very much. Another one coming in from the chat window saying, in the world of low-code platforms and IBPMN, what is the boundary between processes and applications?
Okay, yep. So processes describe, of course, the how. How are we doing things in the organization? The applications that we're building are usually systems that are put in place to potentially support those processes. There's a boundary, of course, in terms of how you might interact or connect those two pieces of data up, in terms of access that information, whether you have things like current states and future states that you're modeling, of course, because current systems supporting those processes might not be those systems that are in place in 6 months' time. So there's a level of combination of kind of producing current and future states there. There's a comment on low code in there as well, I believe. And I mean, low code is an interesting one. It's certainly an area that we think we're pushing into more and more these days. There are aspects that we've mentioned during this presentation around maintaining processes and models, but also optimizing. And that optimization stage was, how do we measure something? How do we measure the performance of these models? Now, that low code approach is typically what we've been deploying. And what we mean by that is you don't want to necessarily have maybe this complex code that you have to develop to build this really difficult to manage algorithm that then changes daily, or people don't know or understand how it works. There are industries, of course, where that is completely true. Facebook has a black box of algorithms and no one knows how they work really, and they rate each page. But when we are designing the models, we want to have these kind of low code or no code based platforms, which means these algorithms that we develop and design are visual. We can clearly see what the steps are. We're applying weightings to different metrics. We're allowing people to see this is how we're calculating the efficiency of this process. There is a slight balance there, just going back to the Facebook thing. There are aspects when we build algorithms or low code and how we separate the objective we might call way of building algorithms, as in we want to calculate the functional fit or the business fit of an application. There are various metrics we can take into consideration: how many processes it supports, how much it costs, what's its criticality. That's all visible. However, there's a slightly more cutting edge side of that, which we've also worked with in terms of machine learning. There are aspects where we don't really know how we want to calculate this metric, but based on all of this information we have, what can we actually glean from that? Can we kind of fill in the blanks here because there are similarities between this domain and this domain, or this process and this process over here, process A and process B, are using exactly the same systems? Is there a smarter way of trying to understand and highlight that and say, well, maybe these processes are the same, or maybe there's a rationalization on the system level? So again, we can take the objective approach with low no code, but we can also take a slightly more, dare I say, futuristic view of having machine learning algorithms run for us as well.
Thank you, Andrew. Not just trying to throw the hard ones at you, but here we go. So another one coming in is, how do we capture an overriding or underlying technology theme like AI in a process? So do we need specific AI-based building blocks for representations?
Yeah, again, interesting. So I think, so let's say we're designing that process. One of the first things, of course, when you're designing that process and the various tasks or activities being performed, is an attribute you tend to capture is whether something is manual or automated, let's say. So are there aspects of this process that are manual, and are there aspects that are or could be automated? If AI is involved in that process, so if we think of applying something like RPA or something, you might want to capture that as a functional block or a building block, and represent that process is actually supported by this, let's say, AI technology theme. It really depends on why you're doing that and what you get out of it. If there's a case where you're trying to identify how many of our processes are underpinned by this AI technology theme, or underpinned by any other technology theme, that's useful. But you have to keep in mind that there might be specific areas of diving deeper into that. For example, AI is a relatively high level general term. Are there specific parts of that? Do we have chatbots as part of a process for customer support? Do we have automatic fraud detection for things like submitting checks or applying for loans? Are there specific technologies in place? So yes, those building blocks are useful. At times, you might want to delve deeper into the technology itself and how that's supporting the processes.
Thank you, Andrew. One of the next ones coming in is, can you make BPM levels 1, 2, and 3 models immediately with Abacus?
Yeah, I mean, the quick answer is yes. I think you've mentioned 3 levels there. Of course, you could be modeling processes to any number of levels. We've mentioned there's a degree of flexibility in how you model those processes. Keep in mind, again, though, who your audience is. There's levels of abstractions of processes. So someone wants a high level view of how we do something. Someone wants a low level view. So you could be modeling those processes into any number of different levels. We kind of classify that as a hierarchy of processes. So yes, you could have 3 levels of processes, so 3 levels of hierarchy. Again, what I would quickly say there, just because it's related to Abacus directly, is there are kind of reference architectures, reference frameworks out there as well that can help. So the various industry ones, there's things like BIAN, there's MITRE for the medical industry, there's APQC, who produce process classification frameworks. So yes, I know that's a lot of acronyms, but all of those models will give you some guidance, and we support some of those out of the box as well. Even if you had information that you were importing into Abacus, there's a structure to that information. I tend to see a lot more structure around business processes than I do around anything else, which hopefully is a good sign. But if you do have that structure in place, then yes, you could easily import that as well and build models from that pretty quickly in Abacus.
Thank you. I think we'll take a last couple as to not completely wear Andrew out this morning with a barrage of questions. And any we don't get to, by the way, this morning, we'll make sure we'll get an answer to them and send them out to everyone, just to make sure your questions are addressed, or anything further you'd like to know, please do contact either myself, Andrew, or any of the emails you have of Avolution, and we can make sure we can set up a personal Q&A session for yourselves as well. So another one coming in at the moment is, what is your opinion about RPA? How is it related to EA? And does Avolution have an enhanced plan to increase collaboration of RPA and EA?
Yeah, so RPA, interestingly enough, actually, you'll probably find a few different ways of defining that acronym, but robotic process automation, in terms of how do we introduce some aspects of potentially AI into those processes. The quick thing maybe to highlight there is, us as a tool, we're an EA tool, BPM tool, and we cover various aspects and various domains. There are going to be tools that are dedicated just to those areas. There are tools that are just business process related, just for data modeling, just for RPA. And there are aspects that you have to consider again in terms of what we're doing and why. If we're wanting to model something and realize that we have EA embedded already, we have Abacus set up, we have our architects working, building solutions, building products and models, and we want to connect in business process modeling. One of the reasons for doing that, of course, is to understand how changes affect those processes. From an RPA perspective as well, especially if we're running things through like orchestration tools, there might be other tools that we export content from Abacus to. We might want a more dedicated tool somewhere to provide some of that analytics. But again, from an RPA perspective, it's certainly an area that we've been looking into a bit more. And I say that because process modeling is constantly evolving. And I think we've come to a stage where there's a good blanket number of tools which support business process modeling. Our focus is, how do we then analyze those processes? What are the attributes and the metrics we're calculating, and why are we calculating those? So we can definitely follow up with a bit more detail around RPA specifically. But again, sometimes it depends on the reasons for doing that. And the combining that with EA, of course, is relevant, as is most things when you're looking at building a model of the organization and how it can improve. That, of course, becomes a really important aspect. But yeah, we'll certainly follow up with a bit more detail on that in the next few weeks.
Definitely. And the final question for today, we're going to take it from the Q&A part. So can you map and represent these processes across different enterprise domains, technology platforms, etc.?
Yes. So one of the common things when we design these processes, and because we work with customers maybe globally, is there are going to be different domains, different even regions and geographies that have similar processes, perhaps, maybe even the exact same process, but use different technologies, use different platforms, use different systems. So when you are mapping those processes, it is important to remember that you might want to relate those to the domain that they belong within. And so when you do start capturing that, when you're building your architectures in Abacus, for example, we've typically talked about things like current states and future states. Where are we now and where do we want to be, and how do we model that? Another important aspect is those architectures themselves can be separate. Maybe we do have an architecture for a specific domain. Maybe we are building models within that domain just to see the impact. So typically, when you are building those, you will have different underlying technology. You'll have different domains that are connected to those processes. And all of those are going to be key to model within the tool. One of the things I will probably quickly point out on that is you'll see across a whole bunch of other frameworks how that's useful as well. When we talk about processes and technology platforms, various frameworks have various ways of dealing with it, but in essence, it's just a connected model. We have these objects and relationships, they're connected to each other. We're applying some kind of domain level knowledge across that, of course, through the architectures or through the diagrams and different representations of those diagrams. But one of the things you'll quickly find is open up some of those models. You'll see how some of the examples are built, and then you'll quickly see how you can start shaping some of the data that you already have to maybe be more structured and more aligned to some of those frameworks as well.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much today, Andrew, for presenting. I think that will wrap it up for today. Brilliant attendance as well. So we will thank everyone for joining today and the brilliant questions we've had. Potentially one last thank you to Amy from our marketing team who made this all possible. But like I say, any further questions, please do send them in to us. If you want a trial of the software, please do contact myself or any other members of the team, and we'll be sure to help and assist you from then on. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks for your time, everyone.